Hello, and welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy listening to stories before bed, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means a lot and keeps me motivated to bring you more late night stories that blend mystery, atmosphere, and real human encounters. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. It was just past midnight on a cool spring evening in New York City. The date was April 14th, and the streets of Lower Manhattan were quieter than usual, though the faint hum of distant traffic never truly disappeared in this city. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched out before me, its Gothic stone arches glowing faintly under the dim, yellowish street lamps. The air carried the scent of the East River, a mix of salt and metal, and every step I took echoed softly against the wooden planks beneath my feet. I had been walking for nearly 15 minutes, leaving behind the bustle near City Hall Park. My destination was unclear. I only knew I needed some air, some space away from the crowded bars and restaurants. Midnight strolls on the bridge had always been a form of quiet therapy for me, a reminder that even in a city of millions, solitude could still be found. Halfway across the span, with the Manhattan skyline glittering behind me and Brooklyn's quieter silhouette ahead, I noticed a figure leaning against the railing. A man, perhaps in his early 40s, dressed in a long, dark coat, with a gray scarf loosely draped around his neck. The glow from the streetlight nearby caught the edges of his face, revealing tired eyes but a calm composure. I slowed my steps, debating whether to walk past without acknowledgement or to say something. It felt unusual to see someone standing alone there at this hour, gazing out over the river as if waiting for something unseen. As I drew closer, he turned slightly, and our eyes met. His voice carried a trace of an accent, British, unmistakably. "Strange time for a walk, isn't it?" he said, his tone measured, almost reflective. I hesitated, then replied, "You could say the same. Not many people choose the Brooklyn Bridge after midnight." He gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "True, but sometimes the city feels more honest when it's quiet. Don't you think?" There was a stillness between us, broken only by the sound of the river below and the occasional car rumbling across the lanes behind us. His presence didn't feel threatening, though it carried a certain gravity, as though he had been waiting for someone to notice him, to speak. I leaned on the railing beside him, following his gaze toward the dark water. "You're not from here," I said, the accent making my assumption easy. "London," he confirmed. "My name's Thomas." He extended a gloved hand, and I shook it lightly, the leather cold against my palm. "And you?" "Daniel," I answered. "I live a few blocks away." Thomas nodded slowly, as if storing away the detail. For a moment, we both stared out at the reflection of the city lights on the rippling water. The wind pushed against us, rattling the steel cables above, making the entire bridge feel alive, like a massive breathing structure. "Do you ever wonder," Thomas said after a pause, his voice softer now, "why certain places draw strangers together? Why here, of all places, and at this hour?" I glanced at him, caught off guard by the depth of the question. His expression was thoughtful, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. It wasn't casual small talk. He seemed to be reaching for something heavier, as though testing whether I would engage or walk away. The night stretched on, quiet but full of unspoken tension. The conversation that began with simple observations was slowly shifting into something more personal, more mysterious. The wind carried a faint chill that made me tuck my hands deeper into the pockets of my jacket. The silence stretched for a moment longer, punctuated only by the muted rush of cars beneath the pedestrian walkway. Thomas shifted his weight against the railing, the folds of his coat catching the light in soft, uneven patterns. "You know," he said finally, his tone as calm as the river below. "Back in London, I often found myself walking across Tower Bridge when I couldn't sleep, always at odd hours. Somehow, the water has a way of reminding me that time moves on, even when you feel stuck." I nodded slowly, tracing the thought in my mind. "I've done the same here plenty of times. Maybe it's the sound, or the sheer vastness of it, that pulls something out of you." Thomas tilted his head, his gaze still fixed far beyond Brooklyn's shoreline. "Do you walk because you can't sleep, or because you don't want to?" The question struck me deeper than I expected. I hesitated, watching the faint outline of the Williamsburg Bridge to the north. The truth was, sleep had been elusive lately. My mind often turned restless with memories I couldn't quiet. But I wasn't ready to share that with a stranger. "A bit of both," I answered carefully. "Some nights are quieter on foot than in bed." Thomas let out a breath that might have been a laugh, though it carried no humor. "Yes, I know that feeling too well." For a few seconds, he didn't speak. His hands rested on the railing, fingers gripping the cold metal, as though grounding himself. His posture suggested a man at ease, but there was a weight in his shoulders, a heaviness that betrayed otherwise. I studied him quietly, uncertain if I should push the conversation further. He had the air of someone who wanted to be asked questions, who wanted to reveal something, but couldn't quite begin on his own. "So, what brings you here?" I asked. "Not just the bridge, but New York at this time of year." Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line before he responded. "Business, technically, but truthfully, I came for something else, something less tangible." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" His eyes shifted to mine for the first time in minutes, and I noticed how pale they seemed in the light, like gray skies before rain. "Closure," he said simply. The word hung between us, heavy and deliberate. Closure. I didn't ask immediately what he meant. Instead, I let the silence breathe, the river's rhythm filling the void. His gaze drifted back toward Manhattan, as though he could find his answers somewhere among the glowing towers and sleepless windows. "When I was 22, Thomas continued at last, his voice measured but lower now, "I spent a summer here. I was reckless, foolish perhaps, but alive in ways I haven't felt in years. I met someone during that time, a woman named Eleanor. She lived near Brooklyn Heights. We would walk this bridge often, usually at night, talking about everything and nothing. She had a way of making the city feel like a story you wanted to stay in." He paused, pulling in a slow breath, his eyes clouded. "But life doesn't wait for you. I had to return to London. She stayed here, and we promised to keep in touch. For a while, we did. Then one day, the letters stopped. The calls, too. I thought I'd move on, but I never quite did." His words carried a sincerity that silenced me. There was no performative drama in his tone, just the quiet ache of someone revisiting a memory that never settled. "Have you tried to find her since?" I asked gently. A faint smile touched his lips, though it was brittle. "Once, years ago, I learned she'd married, had children, built a life here. I respected that. But last week, I received a message from her daughter. Eleanor passed away in February. The sound of the river suddenly seemed louder, harsher, as though it echoed the truth of his words. "I came here because this bridge was ours in a way," Thomas said. "I thought standing here might, I don't know, close a chapter. Or open one, perhaps. I didn't know what to say." There was something profoundly human in his confession, something that blurred the line between stranger and companion. I felt the weight of his story pressing against the night air, mingling with my own unspoken restlessness. We stood quietly again, both leaning on the railing, both staring at the city lights shimmering like scattered jewels on the water. After some time, I asked, "Does it help? Being here again?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure yet, but I think talking about it does." His voice softened, almost lost in the wind. "Funny, isn't it? Confiding in someone you've only just met." "Maybe that's the point," I replied. "Strangers don't carry your history. They just listen." For the first time, his smile seemed genuine, faint but real. "Yes, exactly." The minutes stretched, and I realized it was nearly 1 in the morning. The bridge, though never fully empty, had grown quieter. A lone cyclist passed us, the whir of his tires fading into the distance. The cables above hummed faintly with the push of the wind. "You know," Thomas said suddenly, straightening his posture, "I almost didn't stop tonight. I almost walked past the entrance, but something told me I needed to. Maybe it was so I'd meet you." I chuckled lightly, though part of me understood what he meant. Some encounters feel arranged by something larger than chance. "So, Daniel," he asked, turning to me now with curiosity, "what keeps you walking out here at midnight?" I hesitated. It was my turn to either share or retreat. His openness invited me, though the vulnerability of revealing my own truth made me pause. The water below rippled, carrying fragments of moonlight across its surface. I took a breath, steadying myself. "I guess you could say I'm also looking for closure. Not from someone I lost, but from something I can't let go of. This bridge, it makes me feel like the city listens, even when people don't." Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "Then perhaps tonight we're both here for the same reason." The night seemed to stretch wider around us, and the sense of isolation gave way to a strange kind of kinship. The night pressed on, and the rhythm of the East River carried a steady song beneath us. The bridge cables trembled faintly in the breeze, as though whispering stories of countless souls who had crossed here before. I found myself staring at the skyline, wondering how many other strangers had shared moments like this, drawn together by a city that never seemed to sleep. Thomas adjusted his scarf, his expression thoughtful. "Do you believe in coincidences, Daniel?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had wrapped around us like a heavy coat. I turned to him, unsure how to respond. "Sometimes, but lately, I've been leaning toward thinking that most encounters happen for a reason." He studied me carefully, the lines of his face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp above. "I used to think the same. That's why Eleanor meant so much to me. Meeting her felt inevitable, as though she had been waiting on that bridge in London. Though it was here in New York where I truly understood her. She was different, and losing her without a proper goodbye has haunted me for decades." The way his voice faltered at the word haunted told me more than his words did. There was no performance, no attempt to dramatize, only honesty. I asked gently, "When her daughter reached out to you, what did she say?" Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. "She found an old letter of mine among Eleanor's things. Apparently, her mother had kept it safe all these years, tucked away in a drawer. She said Eleanor would sometimes mention a man from London she once walked the Brooklyn Bridge with. Her daughter thought I might want to know. That she had passed peacefully. The image struck me. An old letter, kept for decades, folded and yellowed by time. A silent testimony to a connection neither of them had fully let go. I felt a pang in my chest, imagining how a simple piece of paper could outlive the voices that once gave it meaning. "And now you're here," I said softly. "Yes," Thomas replied, almost in a whisper. I couldn't stay away. I needed to stand here again, to feel the wood beneath my feet, the cables above my head, to remind myself she was real, that we existed. The wind picked up, ruffling his coat and carrying the scent of the river more strongly. I could hear the faint clink of a buoy somewhere downstream, a lonely sound that seemed to echo his sentiment. We stood in silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of memories, his and mine, both suspended in the night air like smoke that refused to disperse. He glanced at me then, his gray eyes steady. "And you, Daniel, you hinted at something earlier. What is it that you can't let go of?" I shifted uncomfortably, unsure if I was ready to open that part of myself. But there was something about his honesty that compelled me. This man had bared a part of his soul to me, a stranger on a bridge. To remain guarded felt unfair. "I lost my brother 2 years ago," I admitted quietly. The words came slowly, as though they resisted leaving my lips. "Car accident, just outside the city. He was younger, full of plans. I was supposed to meet him that night, but I was late. I still wonder, if I'd been on time, maybe things would be different." Thomas's face softened, and he turned fully toward me. "I'm sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his voice carried a weight that went beyond polite sympathy. "Guilt is a cruel thing, Daniel. It convinces us we hold the power to change what was never ours to control." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I know that logically, but logic doesn't quiet the nights. That's why I walk. Out here, the city doesn't judge me. It just listens. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he understood every syllable. "And perhaps that's why we were meant to meet. Two men carrying ghosts, finding each other in the middle of the night." The lamps flickered faintly above us as though agreeing. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was companionable, like the bridge itself had woven our stories together in its steel and stone. At one point, Thomas pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of being handled. He held it out to me. This was Eleanor, taken the summer we met. I studied the picture. A young woman with bright eyes and an easy smile stood against the backdrop of the river. There was something timeless in her expression, a spark that seemed alive even in the faded photograph. "She looks kind," I said softly. "She was," Thomas replied, a faint tremor in his voice. "She saw me when I didn't know how to see myself." I handed the photo back carefully, as though it were a fragile relic. He tucked it away, pressing the pocket closed with a deliberate gesture, as if sealing the memory back where it belonged. The city behind us hummed faintly. The skyline was dotted with thousands of windows, each a world of its own, each holding stories we would never know. Yet here we were, two strangers telling our own, on a bridge that had carried countless others across. "What will you do tomorrow?" I asked, curious. Thomas exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "I don't know. Perhaps I'll walk again. Perhaps I'll visit the neighborhood where she lived. See if the streets remember her better than I do." Or maybe I'll sit in a cafe and watch people hurry by, just as we did once. And then, I'll go back to London. His words carried the heaviness of inevitability, but also the faintest spark of release, as though saying them aloud was part of his closure. I checked my watch, realizing the hour had crept past 2 in the morning. The bridge was nearly deserted now, save for the occasional jogger or taxi far below. The air had grown colder, my breath visible in faint clouds. Yet I didn't feel the weight of tiredness. The conversation had anchored me, pulling me out of my own restless loop. Thomas turned to me with a small nod. "Thank you, Daniel, for listening. Sometimes that's all a man needs, to be heard once more before he can let go." I returned his nod, my voice steady. "And thank you for sharing. Sometimes strangers understand what friends cannot." We didn't shake hands again. We didn't need to. The bridge itself seemed to have bound our encounter in a way more lasting than formality. As the night stretched on, we continued to stand there, not always speaking, sometimes just watching the water move endlessly beneath us. 2 men carrying stories heavier than the bags on their backs, finding a rare stillness in the heart of a city that never stopped moving. And though dawn was still hours away, I sensed that this meeting, as fleeting as it might be, had already shifted something deep within both of us. The hours stretched quietly on the Brooklyn Bridge, each minute blending into the next until time itself seemed suspended. The sound of the river below grew steadier, almost like a lullaby. I pulled my jacket tighter as the chill deepened, but there was something strangely comforting about the cold air brushing against my face. It felt real, grounding, as if the night wanted to remind me that I was alive. Thomas leaned heavily on the railing now, his figure silhouetted against the distant Manhattan skyline. The orange glow of the streetlights highlighted the lines etched into his face, the marks of years that carried both joy and regret. He looked older in that light, but at the same time, he looked free, like a man who had finally spoken words he had carried in silence for too long. "I almost didn't come here tonight," he admitted after a long pause. "I almost stayed in my hotel room, convinced myself that memories are better left alone. But the truth is, they haunt you more when you refuse to face them." I glanced at him, letting his words settle. "Sometimes I wonder if facing them only makes the wound deeper." He gave a faint nod. "It does, at first, but then you realize wounds don't stay open forever. They scar, yes, but scars don't bleed." His words lingered with me. I thought about my brother again, about that night I failed to arrive on time. For so long I had avoided retracing those memories, convinced they would suffocate me. Yet here I was, confessing them to a stranger, and instead of drowning, I felt lighter. "What was the last thing you said to her?" I asked quietly. Thomas's eyes glistened faintly under the lamplight, though no tears fell. "That I'd write. And I did. Many times. I told her about London, about the music I was listening to, the books I was reading. I told her about my failures, my hopes. And for a while she replied. Then one day, the letter stopped. I never knew why. I convinced myself she had moved on, and maybe she had. But when her daughter told me about the letter she kept, I realized she never truly let go either." He looked back toward the water, his hands tightening slightly around the railing. "It's strange, isn't it? That a piece of paper can outlive a heartbeat. That words inked decades ago can carry more weight than the silence of years." I found myself nodding, the truth of his reflection pressing into my chest. I kept my brother's notebook, I admitted. He carried it everywhere, jotting down half-written poems, song lyrics, sketches. I can't bring myself to read it all. Sometimes I flip through a page or two, then shut it quickly. It's like I'm afraid of learning who he might have become. Thomas turned to me, his expression softened by empathy. Perhaps, Daniel, the notebook isn't there to show you who he could have been. Perhaps it's there to remind you of who he was. And that was enough. The silence after his words was heavy, but not suffocating. We let the city's sounds fill the void. The distant sirens, the occasional honk, the steady hum of engines below. The cables above vibrated faintly, carrying the whispers of the wind. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Though I didn't check the time. I didn't want to. Time belonged to someone else. The bridge had suspended us in its own rhythm. Eventually, Thomas pulled a small object from his coat pocket again. This time not a photo, but a lighter. He flicked it absent-mindedly, the small flame dancing briefly before vanishing. The smell of flint lingered in the air. "Do you smoke?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore. I carry it because she once gave it to me. Said every man should own a flame, even if he doesn't use it. I suppose I've carried it all these years as a reminder of her." I studied the lighter, the way his fingers lingered on it, the way his eyes softened. It was clear the object held more weight than its size could ever suggest. "Do you ever think," he continued, his voice distant, "that certain places keep memories alive more than we do? That maybe this bridge remembers our laughter better than I ever could?" The question sent a shiver through me, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the truth in his words. I looked around us. The wooden planks worn from millions of steps, the stone arches rising like guardians of history, the endless cables that seemed to weave stories together. Yes, perhaps the bridge remembered. "I think so," I replied. "That's why I keep coming back here. It feels like the city holds space for us when we can't hold it ourselves." Thomas smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from recognition rather than amusement. "Yes, that's exactly it." We fell into silence again, watching the river churn beneath us. A ferry moved slowly across the water in the distance, its lights glimmering like stars against the dark current. Somewhere behind us, a group of tourists laughed faintly, though their voices quickly faded into the distance. It must have been close to 3 in the morning when the air grew colder still. My breath was a steady cloud, and even Thomas rubbed his hands together for warmth. Yet neither of us made a move to leave. "Do you ever think you'll stop coming here?" I asked suddenly. He considered the question. "Perhaps. One day. When I no longer need the bridge to carry my ghosts. Until then, I think I'll keep returning, even if only in memory." I nodded, feeling the truth of his answer resonate within me. Maybe I too would always come back here, until the city no longer needed to listen for me. As the hours slipped by, our conversation wove between silence and words, between memories and reflections. He told me about his youth in London, about the jazz clubs he used to sneak into, about the way Eleanor once danced barefoot on this very bridge while the city slept. I told him about growing up in Brooklyn, about the nights I spent staring at the skyline with my brother, dreaming of futures we never reached. The nights stretched endlessly, yet not once did I feel the urge to leave. The bridge, the city, the river, they all seemed to cradle us in a cocoon of time, a sanctuary for two restless souls. When I finally glanced at my watch again, it was nearing 4. The sky in the distance had begun to soften, faint streaks of gray hinting at the coming dawn. Thomas noticed it too. He straightened slightly, pulling his coat tighter. "Morning is coming," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. "And with it, the world will return. Crowds, noise, life. Our solitude will vanish." "Maybe that's why these hours matter," I replied. "Because they belong to no one else but us." He looked at me, his eyes glimmering with something unspoken, then nodded in agreement. We did not move yet. Instead, we stood together as the first faint light began to touch the skyline, casting a pale glow over the water. The bridge seemed to sigh beneath us, as though it too knew our time in the stillness was coming to an end. And as the city prepared to wake, Thomas and I remained in place, two strangers bound not by history, but by the quiet recognition that sometimes the deepest conversations happen not with those we know, but with those we meet only once, in the in-between hours of night and dawn. The faint light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, brushing the sky with shades of gray and pale blue. The towers of Manhattan stood like silhouettes against the coming day, their sharp edges softened by the mist that lingered over the river. The Brooklyn Bridge beneath our feet seemed to hum with a new energy, as if it too sensed the world was about to awaken. Thomas stood beside me, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He had gone quiet for a while, and I could see from his distant gaze that his mind had slipped back into memory. His hand still rested on the railing, fingers tapping lightly, a rhythm only he seemed to hear. "You know," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of fatigue and reflection, "Eleanor once told me that mornings on this bridge were different from nights. She said night belonged to secrets, but dawn belonged to promises." I looked at him, curious. "And do you believe that?" A faint smile crossed his face, one touched with melancholy. I think she believed it. That was enough for me. She had this way of seeing beauty where most people saw nothing. A puddle on the street was a mirror. A shadow on the wall was a painting. Even here, she claimed the bridge whispered to her. I thought she was mad at first, but then I started to hear it too. I turned my eyes to the river below, listening to the endless rush of water. The sound wasn't a whisper, not exactly, but I could understand what she might have meant. The bridge held a voice of its own, forged from footsteps, winds, and steel cables that sang softly against the air. "Maybe she wasn't wrong," I said. "Maybe the bridge does whisper. Maybe it carries the voices of everyone who's ever crossed it." Thomas's eyes flicked toward me, as if surprised by the thought, then softened. Perhaps that's why I came back, to listen one last time. The sun was not yet visible, but the light had grown stronger. The lamps along the bridge, dim and yellow through the night, looked pale now in comparison. Shadows shifted slowly, stretching westward. A jogger passed us, his shoes striking the planks in quick, steady rhythm. He gave us a polite nod as he moved on. The intrusion of another presence felt almost startling, as though the bridge had been ours alone for too long. I glanced at Thomas. "Do you ever think you'll come back again after this trip?" He considered the question for a long time, his eyes fixed on the skyline. "Maybe, or maybe I'll let this be the last time. Some places are meant to be left in memory, not revisited again and again. Otherwise, they stop being sacred." His words struck me, because they echoed something I had felt but never put into words. I often returned to this bridge at night, trying to wrestle my grief into silence. But maybe, just maybe, there would come a night when I would no longer need to. I asked almost hesitantly, And if this is the last time, will it be enough? Thomas let out a slow breath, one that misted in the cold air. I think so. I've spoken her name again, out loud, in the place where it mattered most. I've let the bridge remind me of who we were. And I've told someone who will carry her story beyond me. Yes, I think that's enough. I felt the weight of his words settle into me. It was true. Just by being here listening, I had become part of Eleanor's story, part of Thomas's, and maybe he had become part of mine. We both leaned against the railing again, side by side, our silence no longer heavy but companionable. The first hint of orange bled into the horizon, faint but undeniable. The city was beginning to wake, though slowly. The hum of cars below had grown steadier, and I could hear a distant horn from the Brooklyn side. The bridge no longer felt deserted. It was shifting, preparing for the day's chaos. And with it, I felt a quiet urgency, as if the spell of the night was slipping away. Thomas must have felt it too. He straightened, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "It's almost time," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For the city to take itself back," he replied. His eyes lingered on the skyline. Then he turned to me. "Daniel, you've given me something I didn't know I needed tonight." "Thank you." I shook my head. "I should be the one thanking you. You've said things I needed to hear, even if I didn't know it before." For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Two strangers who had somehow become confidants in the span of a few hours. There was no need for more words. The silence itself was enough. Then Thomas reached into his pocket once more, pulling out the lighter. He held it in his hand, staring at it with a mixture of sorrow and fondness. After a long pause, he extended it toward me. "Take it," he said softly. I blinked in surprise. "I can't. It's yours. It belonged to her." "It belonged to us," he corrected gently. "But it doesn't need to weigh me down anymore. You'll carry it differently, without the same ghosts. Maybe it can remind you that memories are not burdens. They're proof that we lived." I hesitated, staring at the small object, the metal catching the first traces of dawn's light. Slowly, I reached out and took it. The weight in my palm felt far greater than its size. "I'll keep it safe," I promised. Thomas nodded once, firmly, as though sealing something unspoken between us. "That's all I ask." The city was brighter now. The lamps above flickered faintly, then went out, their duty done for the night. Morning was here. Thomas adjusted his scarf and coat, preparing to leave. I could see the resolve in his posture, the way he carried himself. He had found his closure, or at least enough of it to continue. We began walking together toward the Brooklyn side of the bridge, our footsteps slow, unhurried. The wooden planks creaked softly beneath us, their sound blending with the rising rhythm of the city. At one point, Thomas stopped and looked back at Manhattan. The skyline glowed in the soft light, a sight that would soon be swallowed by the rush of daytime. He took one last, lingering look, then turned away. As we reached the first stone arch on the Brooklyn side, he turned to me. "This is where we part, Daniel." I felt an unexpected heaviness in my chest, though I knew it was inevitable. "Will you be all right?" He gave a faint, genuine smile. "I think so. And you? Will you keep walking?" I glanced down at the lighter in my hand, then back at him. "Yes, but maybe now I'll walk a little lighter." Thomas nodded, satisfied. Then, without another word, he extended his hand. I shook it firmly, the cold leather of his glove pressing against my skin. And then he turned, walking steadily down the ramp that led toward the streets of Brooklyn. I stood there for a long while, watching until he disappeared into the waking city. The sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling light across the bridge, painting the steel cables in gold. I looked at the lighter again, feeling the weight of stories it carried. It was no longer just his memory. It was mine too. And as the city stirred around me, I realized something had shifted inside. Perhaps closure was not about forgetting, but about carrying memories in a way that no longer crushed you. I tucked the lighter safely into my pocket, turned toward Manhattan, and began walking back across the bridge, the rising sun warming my face. The night had ended, but its echoes would stay with me, woven into the planks and cables of the Brooklyn Bridge, and into the quieter corners of my own heart. As the first light of dawn began to wash over the Brooklyn Bridge, the silence between us settled into something that felt less like mystery and more like a quiet understanding. Thomas looked out one last time at the river, his eyes softened by the faint glow of morning. He didn't need to say much more, and neither did I. Some encounters are not meant to be explained fully, only carried as fragments, like pages torn from a larger book we'll never finish reading. When he finally turned to leave, the city was already beginning to stir. I stood there for a while longer, listening to the distant hum of traffic growing stronger, watching the skyline bathe in the pale light. I knew I might never see him again, but that brief midnight conversation would linger, etched into my memory as a reminder of how strangers can sometimes leave the deepest impressions. Life in New York carried on, restless and relentless, but the bridge never lost that moment. And every time I crossed it afterward, I found myself glancing toward the railing where Thomas had stood, remembering the way a midnight encounter could feel like a secret shared only between two souls, suspended above the water between two worlds.